20 or so minutes, and then we can have a discussion maybe for the next 20 or 25 minutes and things of that nature. So I've got a short PowerPoint that I'd like to share with you, and then that will get us started maybe, and then we can start thinking about what do you want to do as a neighborhood association in terms of providing wildlife habitat, and what types of wildlife do you want to manage and things like that. And Keith or Audrey, I think when I've got the video up like this that I'm not able to see the chat room. So if you see some questions coming in that are pressing, if you don't mind just interrupting and speaking up, and I'll address the questions as they come in if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So as Keith mentioned in the introduction, most of what my career is focused on is looking at how different types of wildlife live in these urbanized landscapes that we've created for ourselves. As an afterthought, we've created the landscapes for other creatures such as wildlife. And so I've got a number of different research and extension projects going on here in Madison and some other urban areas looking at how do wildlife fit in with this human-dominated landscape that we've created really ideally for human beings, and how do they adapt to that. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And let's see. So my remarks are going to be pretty cursory just in the interest of time, because this remote learning, as I'm finding out teaching on campus, remote learning does not lend itself to long-winded lectures and things like that. So I'm going to try to confine my remarks here. And I would like to point you to this website, urbanwildlifeproject.wisc.edu, that a colleague and I have developed and is online. And everything I'm going to talk about tonight originates from this website. And there's a lot more comprehensive information on this website as well that I would encourage you to go to if you have more interest in what we're talking about tonight. And essentially the whole genesis of this website and really what I do for a career is trying to get people to move from that left-hand picture of very sterile environment in urbanized areas to the right-hand picture where we're actually planting a lot of different vegetation on the land. And that vegetation is very beneficial for us as human beings, but it's also extremely beneficial for wildlife. And the reason I focus a lot on residential communities is because those residential neighborhoods are some of the most stable built environment within that urbanized envelope. So it's not very often that you see neighborhoods being raised and other types of buildings or other type of zoning going into that neighborhood. Once that neighborhood is built, that neighborhood is long lasting for many, many decades. And so neighborhoods really have the ability to provide a lot of very stable and abundant wildlife habitat for many, many decades, and hopefully for even beyond many decades. So there's a number of reasons why you may want to create or enhance or manage habitat on your property. And when I talk about habitat, what I'm really talking about is different types of vegetation that you might plant, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes. But there's a lot of people that are either don't have time to plant wildlife habitat or don't quite see the benefit of it. And so I try to always bring the human component into this. And there's a number of reasons why you might want to actually plant wildlife habitat, whether you're doing it for wildlife or not. There are a lot of benefits for you and for us as human beings. And number one is if you are planting a lot of different types of wildlife habitat or a lot of plants in your property, relative to a similar type property that does not have much plant life on it, you can actually sell your house for a lot more money. And so you have the ability to increase your property values and the resale value. And typically those houses sell at a much quicker rate than a similar type property with not much vegetation on the property. So there's an economic reason you might want to do this. There's plenty of studies that are being done nowadays to look at human health in different types of communities, residential communities. And what they're finding is in areas that have more plant life, that typically the people that live in that area are healthier for a variety of reasons. Number one, they've got healthier air because those plants are filtering a lot of the air quality. But also you have improved emotional health because people are out and they tend to benefit more emotionally and mentally from pretty looking things in their neighborhood. But also people are more inclined to get out and walk and exercise in that neighborhood than if you're in a neighborhood that doesn't have much plant life. And so there's a lot of human health benefits to it. Aesthetically, I think it's more pleasing to have flowering plants and trees and shrubs on the landscape than if you don't have much of that. There's a number of ecosystem services that are provided. So that lower right-hand picture you see here, for example, if you have kind of a canopy of trees around your property or around your house, that typically you have a more stabilized microclimate. So you have lower or reduced heating costs in the summer, excuse me, in the winter, and reduced cooling costs in the summer because you don't have as much fluctuation in that microclimate. Other ecosystem services might include that you're able to attract insectivore birds such as purple martins or swallows, or you're attracting bats, and they might be able to control naturally mosquitoes and other types of flying insects, so that it's more pleasant for you to be outside during the summer months. And the more vegetation you have on the property, the more flood control and water control you have, so you don't have as much flooding because that water isn't able to just rush across the landscape like it would on impervious surfaces or in areas that don't have a lot of plant life. And on top of all of this, all of our native wildlife species have evolved with the native plant life. And so as you plant these different types of vegetation, you have the ability to attract a lot of different types of wildlife. And there have been, again, a number of studies where people really enjoy having wildlife around them for the most part. If you think about feeding birds or the bird feeder, or I know rabbits are not everybody's favorite, especially if you're gardening, but typically people enjoy having wildlife around them and seeing wildlife and things of that nature. So that's good for both the wildlife, having the plant life there. It's also good for us as human beings. And really it comes down to, when you're trying to attract wildlife, it comes down to food, water, shelter, and space. And I'm not gonna elaborate on this too much. A lot of information is on that website, and I'm happy to answer questions, but I could spend 3 hours just talking to you about different types of food, water, shelter, and space in terms of habitat needs and things like that. But really it comes down to, what are you planting for in terms of food, or providing in terms of food, and what do you provide in terms of water and shelter on the space that you either own or occupy, or the space that you have the influence over of managing that property. And so a couple of things to think about in terms of food is typically, well, for food, water, and shelter, we can provide all of these things naturally. So we can plant, for example, a chokecherry bush, or we can plant a holly tree or something of that nature that's providing fruit or some kind of a berry to these a variety of wildlife over the course of different months of the year. So that's a natural example of provision of food. We can also provide a human-provided amount of food similar to that bird feeder you see up in the lower, upper left-hand corner. Water in Madison, and especially water in the Marquette neighborhood, since you have the Tenny Locks there and you're right on the shore of Lake Monona, and you're not too far from Lake Mendota, water is really not an issue for most wildlife, except possibly in the wintertime when that water is bound up as ice. If the animals don't have access to open water sources, that's maybe something you'd want to consider. And then shelter, again, animals use shelter such as that barn owl you see there. They might use a snag in the tree. They might use the eave of your house. If it's a swallow, they might be building nests under the eave of your house. Small mammals like mice or voles might be burrowing into your compost bin or your compost pile in the backyard. And so those are examples of different types of shelter. And for food, water, and shelter, you can manipulate the amount of food, water, and shelter you're providing. You can manipulate the types of food, water, and shelter you provide on that space. And for the most part, the space is the confining amount. We're not building more land. You can't provide food, water, and shelter on space you don't own without that owner's permission and things like that. But on your property, you'd be amazed at how much food, water, and shelter that you can provide, and how you can manipulate that in a way that's positive to attract the types of wildlife that you want to attract. And we'll talk a little bit more about that perhaps at the discussion section. Okay, so here's kind of the menu item of all the different types of wildlife species that we have in the state of Wisconsin. Not that you have the ability to attract all these species of wildlife, nor do you want to attract all these species of wildlife. So for example, that black bear up in the upper picture there, as wonderful as people might enjoy seeing black bears in Madison, not many people want them around because they cause a lot of problems, and they're a pretty big animal to be roaming a city. So that's an example of a species that really we're not providing enough quantity nor quality of habitat in the Marquette neighborhood to hold that animal in that area, nor do we want that animal in there. But there's a whole host of other species that we could have the ability to attract, depending on the types of animals and the type of habitat that are being provided. And so we have species, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, but we've got species that are very specialized in the types of habitats that they require and that they utilize. And we have other species that are a little bit more generalist in nature. And then if you look at this list of species, just by sheer number, we've got about 400 bird species in the state of Wisconsin. About 85% of those species migrate out of our area during the wintertime. So we don't have a large variety of avian species in the wintertime that are resident birds here, but certainly during the summertime when they come back up to breed and be here in our area, we've got a tremendous variety of birds. And just because of the sheer number of species, you've got a much better variety of seen birds in your area, attracting birds to your property, things like that. And then we've got a good variety of mammals here. Obviously the black bear, elk, deer we've got in the city here. Deer is probably one of the largest animals we have, but then we have a lot of mid-sized animals like coyotes and fox and raccoons and skunks and possum, all the way down to very small animals like voles, meadow voles, and different types of mouse species and rats and squirrels and things of that nature. Reptiles and amphibians that typically we don't have a great variety of those species simply because we're so far above the freezing line in the United States, and these animals, reptiles and amphibians, are cold-blooded, so they're very affected by the external environment, the external temperature. But for being up in the northern part of the United States, we have a decent amount of reptiles and amphibians, and I'll talk a little bit more about those species in just a minute as well. So in terms of species that would occupy an urbanized type of an area or a human-dominated landscape, there's all sorts of different ways we can talk about wildlife. We have just classified them as mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians. We can talk about them as game animals. Those animals are able to be harvested versus non-game animals. We could talk about endangered species or non-endangered species. But a convenient way to think about different types of groups of animals or categories of animals in the city are as urban avoiders, urban adapters, and urban exploiters. And urban avoiders are those animals that either there's not a sufficient quantity or quality of habitat to support those animals in the urbanized landscape, or those animals are not invited or they're not welcome into that urban landscape. So for example, that timber rattlesnake you see in the upper left or upper corner there, we have timber rattlesnakes in Wisconsin, and where Madison is, that historically is within the range of timber rattlesnakes, but we haven't had a timber rattlesnake in this area in Dane County, well, in Madison, I should say, for quite some time. And that's an example of a species similar to black bears or wolves that some people would maybe not mind seeing them in here, but a great variety or a great majority of people probably wouldn't want to see those animals in the urbanized landscape. So those are examples of urban avoiders. Other urban avoiders that are animals where the quantity or quality of habitat is just not sufficient to host them in this type of an area would be animals like grassland birds. So we may have grassland birds that move through our area as migratory birds, or they may be in larger patches like the UW Arboretum, but in an area like Marquette neighborhood, you would be very hard pressed to find, for example, grassland sparrows or vesper sparrows or upland sandpipers or things like that. And then we have urban adapters, and those are most of the species that we have in the city right now. So for example, raccoons, as you see in that chimney in the picture there. But urban adapters are species that are generalist in nature, both in the types of food they eat, but the types of landscapes or habitats that they can utilize. And those are a lot of the species that are overly abundant in most urban areas. So that would be white-tailed deer, Canada geese, turkeys, raccoons, skunks, possums, crows, things of that nature, where these animals have just done such a good job of adapting to this urbanized landscape that they can be very opportunistic and live amongst us simply because they are habitat and diet generalists. And then we get into urban exploiters, and an example of that would be that European starling you see there. And a lot of the urban exploiters are animals that are not native. So for example, European starlings or English or house sparrows, that's the same type of a bird, Norway rats, house mice, all of those species are not native to the United States, and we really don't want them here in the United States because they compete and sometimes outcompete our native species. So when I'm talking about attracting wildlife to the urban landscape, I'm not talking about attracting more urban exploiters or more urban adapters. We could pave over the entire Marquette neighborhood with just asphalt, and a lot of the urban adapters and urban exploiters would still show up, just simply because they are so generalist in terms of their species requirements or habitat requirements. What I'm really focusing on, or what I'm really encouraging people to try to focus on in terms of attracting based on the types of habitat they're providing, are those urban avoiders. And again, I'm not suggesting that you attract or reintroduce timber rattlesnakes, but I'm suggesting you think about trying to attract animals that, with a little boost of habitat help, could probably be residents, at least seasonally, within the city of Madison, even downtown Madison, near Marquette neighborhood. And so that would be examples like a lot of our migratory songbirds. So those are species like a lot of the warblers, for example, and other types of migratory birds that typically are not doing well as a group or a niche of species. They're as a group of species, their populations are kind of on a gentle decline. Other examples of urban avoiders might be bat species, and some of the resident bat species we have, like big brown bats, little brown bats, things like that, are falling susceptible to white nose syndrome here in the state of Wisconsin. And so those bat populations are starting to decline on a pretty precipitous rate. Other examples of urban avoiders, which I think would be really interesting to think of from your neighborhood standpoint, simply because you have so much water and aquatic habitat around you, are different types of amphibians. So perhaps some of the salamander species or frog species, and possibly some of the reptile species such as turtles and things like that. So those are the types of species I'm talking about. I'm not sure, it would be a hard sell for me to say, hey, we need more, we need you to attract more rabbits to your yard, especially if you're a gardener. Those aren't the types of species I'm talking about. I'm talking about the species that are relatively rare in urban landscapes, but with some additional habitat provision, I think that they would do quite well in Madison and Marquette neighborhood specifically. So let me just give you some examples of the types of things that you might want to think about as individual homeowners, but also as a neighborhood association that you might be able to provide on the landscape to attract different types of species. And really the basis for everything that you do for wildlife should really be providing more plant life on the landscape. And so the couple of things I want to just really point out here on this slide is, number one, to the extent you can, plant only native plant species, okay? There are more non-native species of plants coming into our state and into our city every single year, and we don't need any more of them. As much as we can, we want to eradicate the non-natives, and we want to plant the natives, and for a number of reasons. Number one, our native wildlife have evolved with the native plants, and so it's a nice synergistic relationship. But typically also a lot of the non-native plants, they outcompete the native plants, so that's not good. And a lot of the non-native plants, that they are not necessarily built to survive our either growing climate or our soil conditions or weather conditions or whatever the case might be. The native plants are a lot more hardy and have evolved with the growing and climate conditions and the climate up here. So they're not going to die off very commonly, and you're not going to have to replace them all that often. The other thing I want to just focus on just for a minute is, obviously we have four very defined seasons here in Madison. And for the most part, wildlife don't really need much help during the spring, summer, or fall, and especially in the springtime once the growing season has started. But when they really need some help is in the wintertime. And so if you can concentrate, and not to the sole exclusion of planting things during spring season or spring, summer, or fall, but if you can kind of focus on at least making sure you have some plants that are either providing some type of food source or shelter source throughout the winter, that would be very, very beneficial, especially for the species that are resident species and are active throughout the entire winter. But the reason I really try to emphasize focusing on the wintertime is as the animals that are here and active throughout the winter, as they go into the winter season, they're in pretty good nutritional health because they've eaten a lot of food through the summer and the fall. And there is usually a sufficient amount of food available in the winter, but as the winter goes on or drags on, they start eating through their natural food source, and they may or may not be able to find human-provided food, such as bird feeders and things of that nature, depending on how often people refill their feeders. And so what happens is, by the end of the wintertime, our resident species that have been active all winter, that they're starting to run out of food because that food is becoming less abundant, and we haven't started our growing season yet to start replenishing that native or natural food. In addition to that, we now have a lot of the migratory birds that are starting to return to our area. So we've got an influx of individuals, an influx of animals back on the landscape at the point in time of the year when we have the least amount of food available on the landscape. And lastly, we have other species that are starting to wake up from hibernation, such as some of the bat species or some of the groundhogs or some other species are just starting to wake up from hibernation. And they also are starting to look for food. And so at the end of winter and before the growing season starts, other than in the peak of the breeding season, that is one of the times of the year when we've got the most number of individuals on the landscape and the least amount of food. So the more you can do to provide food throughout the winter, and especially in that late winter period before the growing season starts, the better off the wildlife is going to be, and the more wildlife you're going to have the ability to attract to both your individual property, but also your neighborhood. Okay, so here's some just examples and some things maybe to think about from a landscaping standpoint, but providing conifers such as spruces, pines, cedars, things like that. Conifers are really beneficial simply because they don't lose their leaves in the wintertime, and so they provide a lot of shelter from the cold winter wind and then the wet snow. They typically don't provide a lot of food, but their value is that shelter. Not an acorn producing plant, so it might be walnuts, it might be red or white oaks, hickories, whatever the case might be. They provide some shelter in the summer, provide a tremendous amount of food in terms of that hard mast throughout the fall for sure, and that will sustain some of the animals going into the winter and throughout some of the winter. Grasses and legumes are really good, so that prairie clover you see there or the sidograma, those are really good because they provide, especially some of the native warm season grasses like sidograma or big or blue or little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. They provide an abundant seed head on those grasses, and they grow as clumps or bunches, so they provide a lot of good cover. And legumes can also be a really good flowering plant, so they can be a good plant for a lot of pollinator species. But obviously as a legume, they also are fixing nitrogen back into the soil. So they're restoring some of your soil health. Nectar producing plants are great. Hummingbirds are a favorite for a lot of people. But a lot of people are also interested in pollinator species. And those nectar producing plants will attract a lot of the pollinator species, such as butterflies, bees, and things like that. And a lot of our bee species are starting to decline for a variety of reasons. So the more you can do to both help wildlife and pollinators, the better off we're going to be as a society. Again, summer and fall fruiting plants, I'm not going to focus on too much simply because there's such an abundance of food on the landscape in the summer and the fall. These animals don't need a tremendous amount of help. But if you can focus on some winter fruiting plants, such as we talked about chokecherry already, sumac's a really good one. Ash is really good if you can avoid the emerald ash borer. You want to be a little bit careful about that right now. Hollies, birches, things like that are really good winter fruiting plants. And there's a whole host of other ones as well. And then there's some vines out there, and vines will provide not only food, but vines provide a lot of really good substrate because of these interconnected and interlocking vines. It's really easy for small birds and smaller mammals to jump into those vines and get away from predators, for example. But a lot of birds will use those vines as substrate to build their nests and provide nesting habitat. Okay, so like I said, the basis for anything you do really should be trying to figure out what do you want to plant from a native plant standpoint that's going to benefit and attract the types of wildlife that you're interested in attracting to your property. But there's a lot of other things that you can do as well, and I'm going to talk about a couple of different types of scales. So we're going to start off with the individual yard, and then we'll move to the neighborhood scale, and then we'll move to the city scale. So, and these are just some examples. This doesn't mean that you have to do this or that these are the only things you can or should do. And again, if you go to that website, urbanwildlifeproject.wisc.edu, everything I'm going to talk about and have talked about so far is provided in much more comprehensive detail than I'm going to be able to provide tonight. But brush piles are really an instant type of way of providing cover. And as you can see in this upper left-hand picture there's a system and kind of a logic to provide brush piles. It's not that you're just heaping brush in a big pile, but you actually want to build the base with relatively larger diameter, either logs or PVC pipe or cinder blocks or something like that. And then you're going to cross that perpendicularly with smaller PVC or smaller diameter branches. And then you're going to cross that with a perpendicular fashion with even smaller diameter branches. Then you're going to build layers of varying diameters. As you go up, you're going to get smaller and smaller in diameter. And by doing that, you're creating all these interstitial spaces within this foundation. It's almost like wildlife condominiums or wildlife apartments, if you will. And then moving to that upper right-hand picture, that's what that brush pile kind of looks like before you put the roof or the cover on it. And that roof would really consist of just newly cut green branches that is going to provide some both cover from the hot sun, the snow, the rain, but also cover from some of the predators, such as the red-tailed hawk that you see in that lower left-hand picture. And so if you start building these brush piles, you start providing a lot of good cover or shelter for small mammals, for a lot of different bird species, perhaps some of the reptiles, if you have garter snakes and things of that nature. But the other thing is, as you start providing habitat and attracting small mammals, you then start building that food pyramid, and you have the ability to attract animals higher up in that food pyramid, such as the red-tailed hawk, or such as barred owls or great horned owls or red fox or whatever the case might be. So you start building a larger food pyramid and more of a comprehensive ecosystem, if you will. I'm not going to talk too much about bat boxes. They're pretty self-explanatory. Bat boxes are great for summer roosting. They're not sufficient or appropriate to hold these animals for hibernatory purposes throughout the winter, but they are a great additional substrate or an additional habitat from a shelter standpoint for bats throughout the warm months. And that's an easy thing to put out there. Providing water, again, you're so lucky to have as much natural water as you do bordering your neighborhood that you don't have to worry too much about water, especially in the summertime. And again, bird houses and bird feeders, I'm not going to elaborate on that because that's pretty self-explanatory, and I'm guessing a lot of you are already doing something along those lines anyway. All right, bumping up to the neighborhood scale. So this might include, multiple homeowners that are abutting each other, working in collaboration. It might be something similar to what we're talking about tonight, where maybe the entire neighborhood association is thinking about how can we provide blocks of habitat throughout our neighborhood that might be collaborative, synergistic, coordinated, and things like that. And so these are just some examples. And again, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but just some ideas for you to think about. And one would be a rain garden. And again, because you've got, you're where you're situated relative to the lakes, this might be something really interesting to provide both in individual properties, but also if you have communal spaces in your neighborhood, maybe providing a rain garden where you're providing water-loving plants. So instead of this kind of muddy puddle, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, you can provide a lot of different plants in those depressed areas that are collecting water. And by providing those plants, not only are you beautifying the neighborhood, so it's much prettier to look at those rain garden plants than it is just a muddy water hole, but you're also providing shelter for a lot of different species. You're providing perhaps food, depending on what types of plants you put in there. You're providing pollinator habitat for pollinator species and things of that nature. And you probably don't have to worry too much about this in your neighborhood because you're so established, but in some of the newer establishment or newer neighborhoods, that by zoning requirements, they have to build either retention and or detention ponds. And a lot of times these are very sterile ponds that are attracting Canada geese and are essentially just a big water basin for mosquito larvae. And instead of having this very sterile retention or detention pond, maybe a reconstructed wetland would be much more beneficial for a whole variety of reasons, both for wildlife and for human benefit. But those are some examples of things that maybe you could do throughout your neighborhood, as well as in individual yards. The other thing to think about, and this is maybe something similar to that brush pile, maybe you're not providing a brush pile in your front yard just because it's not terribly sightly. And maybe you're not leaving dead trees standing in your front yard simply because it's not very attractive or aesthetically pleasing as well. But perhaps in forested areas, either in communal forested parts of the public space in your neighborhood, or in perhaps areas of your yard where people can't see it as well, that if you have a dead tree in your yard, maybe leave that dead tree standing. And I'm not suggesting you leave the entire tree standing, because that's just not safe in an urban landscape. But what you would do is call a certified arborist and have them come out and top that tree. So they would cut off essentially the top part of that tree, so that if the bottom part falls, it can fall within a radius and not fall in your house, your garage, on a fence, on the cars, on sidewalks, roads, whatever the case might be. And so, for example, maybe that arborist comes out and maybe you've got a 45-foot tree. Maybe that arborist cuts 35 feet of that tree off. And so you only have 10 feet standing. And if that 10 feet of the dead tree falls, it can fall safely without falling on, again, house, property, people, pets, whatever the case is. Having 10 feet of a snag or a dead tree is much, much more beneficial than having 0 feet of that snag. And the reason I say that is it's been documented that as many as 100 different wildlife types of species use dead trees. And it starts off with woodpeckers that are creating cavities in there, and then perhaps a flying squirrel would come and enlarge that cavity. And perhaps then, as that tree starts decaying, a raccoon would get in there and start enlarging the cavity for the raccoon. And if you see this tree here, in that top part of the tree where there's an open top to that tree, maybe a great horned owl or barred owl comes and starts nesting in that cavity, in that top part of the dead tree. And so there's a lot of different species that we use these trees, and they're extremely valuable as a habitat practice. And it might be, if you can only do one thing of all the management practices you would have to choose from, leaving snags or dead trees on the landscape might be the most important thing you can do, if it's the only thing you can do. So think wisely and strategically about where you might be able to leave some dead trees in your neighborhood or on your property that could really benefit a lot of different types of wildlife. All right, so now we're going to bump up to the city scale. And so we're going to think about not just Marquette neighborhood, but if you can start recruiting other neighborhoods that are adjacent to you, or if you can start thinking about how can you use your neighborhood to help move animals across that very impervious, very built up landscape that is the Isthmus of Madison. And so think about, start broadening your scale or broadening your perspective outside your neighborhood, and start looking around and see how can you use your neighborhood as either a stepping stone for wildlife to move across your neighborhood to get to other parts of Madison and have good, sufficient wildlife habitat, such as Olin Tenney Park, for example, Olin Turville Park, for example, or some other pocket parks outside of your neighborhood. So think about that. And here are some things to consider. Green roofs and green buildings. If you have the ability on your property, on your on buildings in your neighborhood, if you have either a gently sloping roof or a flat roof, perhaps think about creating a green roof there. And you would have to call, or you should call, an engineer out to make sure that the structure of your house or your building is sufficiently strong enough that you can support the additional weight that's going to be put on your roof in terms of soil or whatever the growing medium is, the vegetation, and the water that's going to be absorbed within that growing medium. So think about that. But there are a number of green roofs throughout the city of Madison. So there are a number of green roofs in some of the dormitories on campus at UW. At the US Bank building downtown, there's a green roof there. There's some other green roofs throughout Madison. But the reason the green roofs are so valuable, and they're not accessible to all wildlife. So if you can't get to the green roof, if you can't fly there, if you can't climb there, obviously it's not accessible to you. But for species that are able to utilize that green roof, they can actually skip across the top of Madison, across the top of buildings. They may not even have to come down to the street level to skip across Madison. And so that can be a really valuable addition to habitat. And again, when you get into the downtown area, if you can think about how not only can you maximize the horizontal space, but how can you maximize the vertical space, that can really increase the amount of surface area that you have to plant to wildlife habitat. So not only think about the roof area, but think about the building. And all these other three pictures here in the slide, these are not photoshopped, or they're not computer generated images. These are actually buildings, real life buildings. And this is a more common thing about green buildings in parts of South America and parts of Asia and some parts of Europe, where they actually integrate planter boxes on the sides of the buildings, the entire vertical structure of that building. And how cool would that be if you could start maybe the side of your garage could be a planted wall, for example, where you could have planter boxes up and down the side of your garage, or along fences or something of that nature. But not only do you start then maximizing the vertical surface area, so you have the ability to provide more wildlife habitat on a very small city lot, but you, I think, would also have the ability to maybe improve your localized air quality, and you've got the ability to increase the aesthetic value of your area. And it's a pretty cool concept that we really don't utilize enough here in North America. The other thing I want to just touch on a little bit here, and this is kind of an idea that is bouncing around in my head, and I'm trying to figure out how to make this work. But I'm trying to figure out how could we maximize the amount of urban wildlife habitat and integrate that with urban agricultural production. And one of the reasons a lot of people are reluctant to attract wildlife, especially if you're a gardener, is because you're constantly doing battle with rabbits or chipmunks or 13-line ground squirrels or whatever the species of wildlife is. And you're remiss or reluctant to try to attract more wildlife because you already experienced enough wildlife damage. So if we could integrate wildlife habitat with urban agricultural production, we would have the ability perhaps to attract the predator species that could control the species that are actually doing damage to our gardens. And by doing that, we're actually broadening the ecosystem, or we're broadening that menu item of the types of wildlife that we have in our community, which would be better off than having just a few overabundant species like raccoons or squirrels or rabbits or whatever the case might be. But if we can increase the diversity of wildlife so that we have really beautiful warblers, for example, we've got a lot of different types of bird species, we've got bats, and we have other species of wildlife, not just these overabundant species that we get tired of looking at and that we're actually doing a lot of management of to try to control some of the damage that they're creating. The other thing I think would be really cool to think about from an edible landscaping standpoint is, could we maximize the amount of agricultural production in Madison? And this might include not only community gardens, but it also might include backyard gardens. So, and this would take a very coordinated effort, but I think if you were to think about this as a neighborhood association, is how can you maximize the amount of urban agricultural production? So you start eradicating food deserts, for example, and you provide accessible, nutritional, economical food to not just people in your neighborhood, but how can you spread that out so we don't have all these communities supported agricultural endeavors are awesome, but they're shipping a lot of that food in from outside of Madison. So we're increasing greenhouse gases because we've got to burn a lot of fuel to get it in here. What if we could provide the food where people live? How fun would that be, and how cool would that be? And not only are we providing as much food as we possibly could, but you're coordinating it so we don't have everybody growing 500 pounds of tomatoes, of which 450 pounds of tomatoes go to waste at the end of the summer. But some people are growing a certain type of specialty vegetable over here, or other people are growing root crops over here, or people are growing lettuce, or maybe you've got beehives and people are producing honey. And maybe if we're struggling with some of these species like rabbits, for example, and we're not attracting enough predators, maybe we actually trap and euthanize the rabbits, and we use the rabbits as an urban protein source for those people who may be willing to do something like that. So to try to think outside the box a little bit about how can we really maximize urban agriculture production and integrate that with urban wildlife habitat, I think would be a pretty cool community and a pretty neat place to live. Okay, so that's it. And I probably have gone over my 20 minutes. I'm sure I have. But again, go to this website if you're more interested in what I've talked about tonight. And I would love to work with you as a neighborhood. And again, I see my role, if you're interested in doing something collaboratively, I see my role not in saying to you, here's what you should manage for, but as a neighborhood, I would like to see organically you come up with a neighborhood as a neighborhood, what you'd like to manage for in terms of wildlife. And then I would be used as a resource and kind of a guiding resource to help you initiate that and help you put that into place and help you plan it out and things like that. So that's kind of what I see my role in this being. And I would love to see Marquette neighborhood do something similar to what we've talked about tonight. I've got another pilot project that's been started and is unfortunately it's stalled a little bit because of the COVID era over in Midville Heights neighborhood on the west side of Madison. But if we can start linking these neighborhoods where we're starting to build blocks of habitat instead of just individual yards of habitat, I think we have the ability to really turn Madison into a very green city, which would be very beneficial from an ecosystem standpoint, much healthier for human beings, but I think also much healthier for a wide diversity of wildlife. So with that, thank you very, very much for enduring everything I just talked about. And I'm more than happy to stay on for a few minutes and answer questions, or if you want to have a discussion about something.
So first I want to say thank you, David. And I want to make sure a couple different things. There have been a couple conversations and questions in the chat. One was focused on sort of described as supporting some of the work of Fred Rissard's lead in providing habitat and backyard backyards instead of gravel lots. And there was asking, are there programs to support residents or influence property owners or building code enforcement or replanting policies of street canopy trees or smaller trees or native plant sales on a native level? So do you know of other places, in other words, that are places that are potential resources to support the ideas that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, so it depends on what you're asking specifically. I mean, again, you know, I'd be glad to use as a resource the website I've focused on or featured here. If you're interested in plants, things like Wild Ones is a native plant society, for example. There are a number of native plant nurseries such as Prairie Moon or what's the other ones? Ecology, I think it's called. You know, and there's a lot of information out through the UW Arboretum that you could focus on if you're interested in that. There's a lot of other permaculture websites out there that, and permaculture is getting a little bit where you're starting to combine wildlife habitat with urban agriculture. But permaculture, at least what I've looked into and I'm familiar with, is more monocultural planting, and it's not as diverse in terms of wildlife habitat that I'm thinking about. So there's a lot of different varieties like that. And the city, I think, would be interested in doing something like this. And we've engaged the city over in Midvale Heights. The response we got from the city landscape architect over there is they are interested in things like this, and they've worked with other neighborhoods where they've tried to plant native vegetation, so pollinator species or native plants or shrubs, to boulevards and public spaces. But the problem is then that whoever initiates that, if they either move or they've lost interest or they don't have time to maintain it, then it becomes a problem for the city because now it becomes weedy or overgrown and things like that. So I think the city is interested in doing things like this. And I just had an email from the landscape architect a couple of weeks ago that in some of the neighborhoods that they're starting to investigate and do pilot sites with like no mow type grasses or no mow type vegetation. So I think they're interested in doing something like this, but I think that the neighborhood would have to demonstrate that we are solidly behind this and we're willing to own the public spaces in our neighborhood, and we'd have contingency plans to maintain that vegetation. The nice thing about a lot of the native vegetation is once you get it established, after about 2 to 3 to 5 years, depending on the species, that there's very, very little maintenance that's required because that vegetation is now mature enough that it shades out the weeds, or the weeds can't compete with that native vegetation. So it really, the intensive part of it, or the labor intensive part of it, is probably year 1 through 3. It's not throughout the lifespan of that vegetation.
Thank you. We have another question here that talks about the two bird species that exploit urban habitats, but are not that are special to exploit urban habitats, not necessarily doing very well because of recent loss of nesting habitats. So the nighthawks that relate to gravel, flat roofs, and chimney swifts. Yep. Do you have recommendations for habitat enhancements to encourage those two species?
Yeah, so nighthawks are, both these bird species are native. They're both insectivores. They feed on the wing. Chimney swifts are more common in Madison. I mean, nighthawks are in Madison, but they typically are more common as they migrate through. So for example, in August, as the dragonflies are migrating through, you see a lot of the nighthawks populations coming through at that same time, because the nighthawks are starting to migrate out south, but they're also following that food source. We do have nighthawks here. They do use those flat gravel roofs for nesting, or flat gravel spaces for nesting, typically more elevated spaces. So if you can try to preserve as many of the flat gravel roofs in your area as you possibly can, that would be beneficial. Or possibly try to create some kind of a gravelly space where they might be able to nest. Because both of these species of birds are insectivores, if you can reduce the amount of pesticides or insect killing chemicals, and again, I'm not a person who says we shouldn't use pesticides at all. I think pesticides are very valuable, and they're a valuable tool, but use them strategically and conservatively. And then the thing with chimney swifts is chimney swifts, as their name implies, that they roost and nest inside chimneys, both industrial chimneys as well as residential chimneys. And one of the things with chimney swifts, one of the reasons that they're on the decline is because those chimneys are typically now being closed off with some kind of a chimney guard, so raccoons can't get inside them, for example. But it excludes the chimneys, or the chimney swifts. So if you have areas where you've got industrial buildings with tall industrial chimneys, and you can leave those chimneys open, that's very beneficial. But you can also build artificial chimney swift towers that the chimney swifts will start to occupy. And so those are some things that you might want to think about building in your area. But both of those species are on a decline population wise, and whatever you could do to benefit them would be great. And that's a great example of species that we would consider really not necessarily urban avoiders, but species that are struggling in terms of population levels. And with a little bit of habitat help, we could actually bring those birds back pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. So there's another comment here about the importance of mowing high, and with irregular lower frequency does a lot for plant variety. And then there was raising the questions about the benefits of bat houses. I think that was related to the chimney sweep. But there is also another question here, so I'll give you both at once, about how big of a role does parcel size, continuous habitat size matter when looking at biodiversity on a yard, neighborhood, city scale?
Yep, let me start with the mowing first. I try to encourage people to eliminate as much mowed turf as possible. Now I say that with a caveat that if you have young kids, that becomes a little bit difficult, because the kids need a place to play, and it's easier for them to be in the backyard and things like that. But if to the extent possible, if you can remove or eliminate mowed turf, that would be extremely beneficial to wildlife, because that turf is really not providing anything to wildlife. It doesn't provide any cover because it never gets tall enough. And every time we mow, we're mowing the best part of that grass off. We're not allowing the seed head to actually establish and become available or accessible to wildlife. So not mowing your lawn is wonderful. The issue with that is there's going to have to be some education in the neighborhood about why you're not mowing, because it does look unruly. And that's one of the things that people are concerned about when you start talking about planting things, especially if you stop mowing. A lot of these native landscapes can be extremely beautiful. And I think they're more beautiful than a lot of the cultivated, manicured landscapes that you might see in gardens and things like that. And I'm not suggesting that you just stop mowing because you're lazy. But if you do stop mowing, you want to make sure that the grass that's coming back is a native grass species or a native turf species. It's not a non-native. If it's non-native, you're not really doing as much beneficial as you could if it's native. The other issue with not mowing, in addition to making sure you communicate with your neighbors as to why you're not mowing, is you may have to communicate with the zoning officer, because they may come by and say, hey, we've got noxious weed laws in the city of Madison. We're going to ticket you if you don't mow your grass. And so you may have to educate the zoning officer a little bit that, number one, these are not noxious weeds, and they're not on the noxious weed list that the state or the city has, but also why you're doing it. So signage sometimes is very important. And sometimes putting up signs in areas where you're, especially in high visible areas, a sign that says, hey, we are restoring this to native habitat to benefit wildlife or whatever the case might be. Just if people understand why you're doing things, they're a little bit more understanding and tolerant of why you do things. So that's a possibility to think about there. The bat houses are very, very valuable. The issue is the bats are when the bats are vulnerable and susceptible is during the hibernatory period, during the wintertime, because that's when they're susceptible to white nose syndrome. So when they're active during the summertime, if you can put out bat houses, it certainly is not going to hurt. So I would put out bat houses to the extent you can. And then the last question was about the size of space. So obviously everything I've talked about in terms of providing food, water, and shelter, if you have a 1/4 of an acre lot, the principles of providing habitat are the same as if you have 500 contiguous acres. You just can't provide as much on your 1/4 acre as you can on 500 contiguous acres. So in that sense, and that's why it's so, I think, important for neighborhood associations or neighborhoods to work together. Because if you have a 1/4 of an acre lot, but you're working with 3 other landowners, now all of a sudden you've got an acre habitat versus 1/4 acre of a habitat. And if you can actually build blocks of habitat instead of having habitat that's isolated, where maybe you have a 1/4 acre or a 1/2 acre habitat here, and then 3 blocks over, you've got other blocks of habitat. If you can have connected habitat or blocks of habitat where the animals can jump from habitat block to habitat block, and they don't have to traverse very far in terms of inhospitable habitat, then you're providing really functional habitat in your neighborhood. So, you know, on a 1/4 acre, you can pack a lot of habitat into a 1/4 acre, especially if you're thinking about vertical space, not only horizontal space. So, but if you can start grouping neighbors together where people are actually working together to have a coordinated effort, and you're all working on the same types of species, same types of habitat generally. It doesn't have to be identical, but if you can generally work together, I think that you're going to have a lot more beneficial and functional habitat in your neighborhood than if you're not doing something like that. So one place to start maybe is, if you've got people who are interested in doing something like this, is go to Google Earth, or if somebody's familiar with ArcGIS, which is a computer mapping software, that start mapping these properties in your neighborhood and see how connected they are or how far apart they are. And then that will also identify, well, we may need to contact these neighbors to see if they're interested in helping us, or, you know, if we just get this block of habitat over here, then we're starting to build bigger blocks of habitat. So looking at it visually across the landscape or across the neighborhood can be a really good starting point.
Mm-hmm. So that sort of brings me sort of to our next, we only have a couple minutes left as part of our conversations, and there's been some conversation about water here and some conversations about creating space on the edges of mowing spaces to allow for ground nesting areas. But I'll raise the question overall for this group. If there's a general interest in folks who are part of this call, we can talk about having a joint conversation of anybody who's interested in a neighborhood approach or a neighborhood-wide plan. So if that is something that you think you might be open to, I can share a link for your involvement. We were thinking about a meeting date in a couple weeks, but it would be best first to kind of get, as the question goes, kind of a show of hands. So if you're interested in that, can you write something in the chat for us saying that you'd be interested in participating in and to have further discussions about a neighborhood plan for our urban habitat.
So as you do that, I'll just talk quickly about the water. So water obviously is an issue, especially where you are situated. But if you put more vegetation on the landscape, and especially the types of vegetation, if you build rain gardens or something like that, you do have the ability to control flooding and at least slow it down a little bit. And so that is a possibility. And that's another thing, maybe we're working with the city engineers and the landscape architects, that may be a strategic type of planting. somebody said something about attracting mid-sized predators. So yes, there are, I've got another project going on where we radio collar fox and coyotes in the city, and we've got red fox that run through your neighborhood. So there are a decent number of mid-sized predators or mesopredators that are running through your neighborhood. It's just a matter of attracting them, and the best way to attract them is to provide food sources for them, and not by throwing out hot dogs, but providing cover where you're actually starting to attract small mammals, and you've got a sufficient amount of food, native food there, that the animals know that there's a reason to come to that property. But that's an example of what I was talking about in terms of trying to integrate wildlife habitat with urban ag, where maybe we could start using these predators as kind of a biological control.
Thank you.
Planting edges is a great thing to do. Similar to what the comment was. That's anything you could do to put plants on the ground and try to maximize the amount of urban wildlife habitat, the better off you're going to be.
Mm-hmm. There's another question here about what are the pros and cons of encouraging mid-sized predators such as fox that control mice and rabbits? And does the city staff support encouraging mid-sized predators?
The city staff doesn't have anything to do with it. The mid-sized predators are here, and they're going to be here regardless of whether we want them to be here or whether the city wants them to be here. So again, I'm coming at it from a wildlife ecology standpoint, an urban wildlife ecology standpoint, that I think mid-sized predators are wonderful to have on the landscape. They're native species. They belong here. They're a great example of how adaptable some of these species can be. And I think that if we've got a healthy coyote population in the city, we've got a healthy red fox population in the city, and you rarely hear about negative encounters with either red fox or coyotes. And so I think it's only beneficial to have these species on the landscape. And again, because they are predators, that it's an opportunity for to kind of use these animals in a beneficial way to help control some overpopulated species like mice and rabbits and squirrels and things like that.
So I think we are at 6:30. David, I really want to thank you, and I'm going to turn this back over to Keith to kind of give us a little bit of a couple of reminders and close us out a little bit for any last thoughts or comments.
On mute. All right. David, thank you so much for joining Green Spaces and Trees. On behalf of all the participants, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. This has been very informative.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry I went a little long, so thanks for tolerating that. And please do reach out if you have any questions. I would love to work with you, and I'm always looking for another pilot project, pilot study to do something. Yeah,
you're offered to serve as a resource for a neighborhood effort. I think we'll certainly be taking you up on that.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to work with you. So thank you so much for inviting me tonight, and hope everybody stays healthy.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And just some housekeeping items for all the participants. I would just like to remind you all that Green Spaces and Trees, our committee in the Marquette neighborhood, we meet monthly, fourth Tuesday of the month. So please, if you're interested in activities to improve public spaces in the neighborhood and sustainability, please visit the Marquette neighborhood website for more information. As well as we have 20 shade and ornamental trees for Marquette neighborhood neighbors in partnership with the Urban Tree Alliance that are available. So if you have a space, high sun, a high visibility area that you might be interested in planting a tree in, please visit the Marquette neighborhood website for more information. So Audrey, any comments about the follow-up meeting at this point, or should we do that by email?
Based on the discussion, I captured all our names and contacts of people who've expressed an interest. So I think actually based on that, our next step will be determining if I'll reach out to them to see when it's possible to meet, and if it's appropriate to have that as part of a meeting prior to our meeting as a committee as a whole. or it'll make sense at that committee time, but we'll reach out to folks who've expressed an interest.
Okay, very good. And I would be remiss not to thank Audrey and Sandy River for all their work. Both Audrey and Sandy are diligent Green Spaces and Committee members, and they're the ones that are responsible for this evening's talk and the invitation of David Drake. So thank you so much for putting this together. This has been wonderful. All right, thank